So we're going to be continuing with the third installment of the Hadith series. And in this one, we'll be going over kind of arguments that support the authenticity of the Isnad system and therefore prove the reliability of Hadith as reliable historical sources. Now, to begin with understanding Isnads, we have to provide a definition. Isnad is a chain of narrators with regards to reporting a narration or a hadith. So, for example, it would be something like A heard from B, who heard from C, who heard from the Prophet. This is kind of important because it's used to trace each report back to the eyewitness or to early transmitters or even to the Prophet himself. If hadith are authentic and if we can show that these narrations are authentic, then the isnads themselves are authentic. And the one way that we can determine this is if each transmitter within the hadith, for example, person A, if he has been checked out and is seemed reliable, then we can form a authentic basis to the claim that, X, Y, and Z was said by the early community or the eyewitnesses themselves. Now, if someone within that chain is seen to be spurious or let's say someone who doesn't have a good track record and it's shown to be fabricated, that would be omitted from the hadith corpus because that would imply that the hadith is forged. We'll be going over some of the Oriental claims as well. So Orientalists like Goldziher and Schacht, they've argued that the isnads were kind of pretty much all late date forgeries, back projected by later scholars with fake isnads to pinpoint earlier transmitters. So we'll look at their arguments in more detail. A useful quote by Schacht is that he says the great majority of tradition from the Prophet were invented by legal scholars. Once again, this kind of implies that we have later scholars making up hadith and attaching isnads to them or back projecting isnads to these hadith to make it seem like an eyewitness was the one who was saying these things. So let's continue. We'll be back with regards to this slide. What I'll do is go over here. So we'll continue with this theme of the Orientalist arguments and their claims with regards to fabrication. To start, we have Goldziher, and his critique is that the hadith collections largely reflect the beliefs and the disputes that were happening in later generations of Muslims. And so he notes that whenever there's a contentious issue in early Islam, whether that be theological, legal, or political, you can find a hadith that supports each side. That led him to conclude that particular fractions of individuals fabricated prophetic sayings to legitimize their own stances. And so Goldziher also believed that by the time hadith were first systematically collected around the second century, much of the material was already adulterated by legends and political agenda, and therefore it can't be seen as reliable. Now, Schacht makes a similar argument, but he has this theory called the common link theory. What he said in his book, The Origin of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, he says that the great majority of traditions from the Prophet are fictitious and that no legal hadith could be confidentially traced back to the Prophet himself, right? He analyzes like isnad growth and he concludes that many chains converge on figures in the second century. And so he calls these figures common links. He's saying these links suggest that those figures were the ones who actually originated the hadith and then back projected it to earlier authorities. According to Shah, the early parts of the Isnad, closer to the Prophet and the companions, were like often later additions. And so he famously says, he says the chain of transmission is a result of an evolution, a second century fabrication by scholars, and no hadith actually emanates from the Prophet himself. So in Shach's view, the Isnad system was essentially an invention to kind of lend credibility or authenticity to newly evolving doctrines by ascribing them to the Prophet. And so we also have a third Orientalist who provides his input. His name is Junaybal. He continues with this line of reasoning and acknowledges what's known as the common link theory by Schacht. He says that many early Muslim scholars projected isnads to these esteemed companions, and that hadith criticism by Muslims was too focused on chains instead of actual rational scrutiny of the content or the text of the hadith itself. He suggests that significant hadith documentation or codification did not occur until the time of the Abbasids. Again, that kind of implies like a long gap where oral tradition was allegedly prone to invention. Now, to counteract these arguments, these are some of the arguments that we will be going through in this presentation. The first of which is the younger companion argument, and we'll be going over these in detail later on. The younger companion argument is that the pattern of younger or less prominent companions transmitting the most amount of hadith. And that kind of seems counterintuitive, right? So if isnads were invented for kind of prestige, it makes no sense to attribute them to younger companions. So that kind of indicates that transmitters were reporting actual teachings they heard rather than arbitrarily assigning codes to big names of Islam. We will go through that in more detail later on. Now, a second argument is that authentic isnads are actually kind of hard to fabricate. So by the time hadiths were being compiled in the second and third century, many hadiths were transmitted through multiple independent chains of transmission. And so what that implies is that, well, we have different regions and scholars who record the same narrations with similar wordings, but the only thing that's different is their isnads. Their transmitters are different. But again, they have very similar wordings and similar narrations. And so this kind of points to a common origin rather than a coincident fabrication. For example, numerous hadith appear in both Shia and Sunni sources, or even in multiple Sunni collections. They have different isnads, but the same content. The fact that you have multiple different regions and you have multiple hadith within these different regions that say the same thing, but have different transmitters tells us these are not later fabrications. So another example is the overlap in content between Imam Malik's Muwatta, which is primarily in Medina, as well as compilations like Musannaf Abdul Razak, which is in Yemen. The fact that there's so much overlap in direct wording, it's hard to explain unless we draw on an existing body of hadith that's already circulating within the first century. That's a powerful argument, and we'll be going over that in a bit as well. Another argument we'll be going over is the presence of mundane features. If you guys have been following along, the last episode touched on this point as well. The idea here is that a common test for authenticity is the criteria of embarrassment. Reports that run counterproductive or kind of embarrassing for the Muslims seem to be not obvious why Muslims themselves would even fabricate them to begin with. So many hadith include details that kind of for the forger might want to avoid even mentioning themselves, right? So, for example, the prophet being corrected by someone or demonic spirits, infecting Muslims, or I don't know, like Muslims losing in battle. These are embarrassing details that fabricators would not necessarily want to produce. The mere fact that we have these within our hadith corpus goes to show that these transmitters were being honest to the text. They were being honest to the circumstances. They're not trying to hide things, right? They're not trying to portray things in a different light. So the very existence of these narrations kind of hints that early transmitters were trying to be faithful in terms of preserving that information. The fifth argument is going over these early documents. Although a lot of Orientalists claim that we don't have any written documents and that it's all oral tradition for the first 2 centuries, that's actually incorrect. We have documentary evidence that shows some hadith were actually being written down very early on. So the Prophet himself instructed some of his companions to write letters and treaties, and companions like Abdullah bin Amr kept a personal notebook of hadith. And and this is like during the Prophet's lifetime itself, right? And not only that, but even within a few decades after the Prophet's death, the Umayyad Caliph bin Abdul Aziz famously launched an effort to officially gather hadith. And once again, this is within the first century after Hijrah. He wrote to scholars, including Imam Zuhri, which we'll be going over his narrations later on as well. He urges them to compile all available hadith so that knowledge would not be lost. This resulted in written hadith collections at the start of the second century, well before books like Bukhari were written. The point here is that we have evidence of early documentary kind of sources that have hadith within them, and that goes to show that hadith were not being transmitted orally. That's not necessarily the case. Again, even within the first 100 years, we have manuscripts that contain hadith. Now, The last argument that we'll be touching on is the Isnad Mutn analysis. There's a lot that's said here, but essentially it's a unique way happening in modern scholarship. It's being implemented in modern scholarship. It's a way to kind of criticize or compare different texts of a hadith in order to determine whether or not that hadith has been faithfully transmitted. These arguments in particular, I think, are the strongest. This presentation will be going over some of these arguments. So we'll start with the first one, which is the younger companions argument. Here we have a table that shows the names of the companions and the number of hadith they've transmitted. A shocking feature is that all of these companions are quite young in terms of age. They're also not the type of companions we would expect to hold a lot of prestige. These are companions who either accepted Islam very late in their life or are very young, or they're younger in terms of when they met the Prophet himself. All of these narrators were from a younger generation of the Sahaba. Some of them met the Prophet, but only in later years of the Prophet's life. For example, Abu Hurairah only spent like 3 years with the Prophet himself. So the mere fact that he transmitted 5,000 reports seems alarming, right? Only after spending 3 years. But the point here is that if isnads were being, freely fabricated and forged, why would forgers not logically want to attribute these isnads to more prominent companions in an attempt to bolster credibility, right? Why not fabricate a hadith and attribute it to someone like Abu Bakr or Ali, right? These are companions who accepted Islam very earlier on. And likewise, they spent more time with the Prophet himself. It seems counterintuitive that these forgers, instead of attributing these hadith to, companions who spent more time with the Prophet, instead they're kind of attributing them to companions who barely spent any time with the Prophet. And once again, that kind of runs counterintuitive that if hadiths were later inventions, but it's not counterintuitive if we presuppose and if we kind of assume that these transmitters were genuinely transmitting what they heard. So this is similarly stated by another Orientalist scholar named John. What he says is, if all isnads were invented, it would have been easy to produce isnads from early companions in great profusion. That the traditionalists did not do this makes us wonder whether they may be more truth than we have imagined in what they transmit. In other words, the relative sparsity in terms of using big names in isnads is an argument for the veracity of the tradition. Another noteworthy point here is that the Muslim historians never actually altered the biographies of the companions to fit with this hadith data. So Abu Hurairah's short time with the Prophet was never erased or extended anachronistically, even though one might expect historians to exaggerate his proximity to the Prophet to justify his large hadith corpus. For example, everyone knows that Abu Hurairah spent only 3 years with the Prophet. This shows the honesty of the early Muslims in terms of keeping record. It also highlights the improbability of a grand forgery project. It seems implausible because if later Sunnis were willing to fabricate thousands of isnads, they would also have very likely have also edited historical details to make those fabrications seem more plausible. But again, the fact that they didn't do this indicates that both the isnads and the historical context themselves were quite preserved. Some might argue that once hadith from these younger companions gained popularity, later transmitters could have started attaching those famous names to these hadith. Now, while some spurious attributions can or probably did have occurred, this again doesn't undermine the initial authenticity of the large hadith corpus itself. So, for a forger to even consider using Abu Hurairah's name, Abu Hurairah's genuine narrations had to be widely known in the first place. The argument repeats because if you're willing to grant that within the earlier periods of time Abu Hurairah was a famous transmitter, then once again that runs counterintuitive. Why would forgers use Abu Hurairah as a means to bolster a report's authenticity when they could have done so with more senior companions? Now, the only way to dismiss the above evidence would be to assume an improbably vast and early conspiracy. You'd have to say that all early Muslims across different regions would have had to agree to fabricate chains using the same names of lesser known companions while ignoring the most famous ones. A historian, I'm forgetting his name, he actually says the same thing, right? So he says, In modern times with mass media, it is impossible to invent whole stories without some form of serious critique offering contradictory information. By analogy, in the first century of Islam, any large-scale invention of false hadith would have met dissenting reports or skepticism from other scholars. The absence of alternate competing narratives about the chains of transmission, for instance, no record of early scholars complaining that all these hadith from Abu Hurairah are fake or that we actually heard something else. Because that doesn't exist, that underscores that the community broadly accepted these isnads as genuine. So once again, this goes back to show that earlier companions, the mere fact that they're being given this much attention goes to show that there's some credibility here. So just kind of summarizes the same thing that forgers would logically prefer big names of companions like Abu Bakr or Umar or Ali, and the fact that this doesn't happen kind of favors authenticity. A noticeable quote here is that the Orientalist says, what's most fascinating about the skeptical approach is that it has been proven impossible to invent whole stories without serious critique. So again, it kind of runs this same critique that if we're willing to grant this kind of massive conspiracy with regards to early hadith fabrication, then that seems very inconsistent even with modern day standards. Now, going on to the second argument, what we see here is that both Sunnis and Shia scholars have strong incentives to authenticate their own prophetic traditions. Yet the outcome in their hadith literature differ quite remarkably. So if we can kind of go over these numbers, right? Sunni hadith corpus itself, if we look at the Sunni hadith corpus, Sunni Islam developed an elaborate science of hadith criticism early on. By the third century, Sunni scholars like Bukhari, Muslim, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, they've compiled large collections of hadith with quite strict criteria on how to grade those hadith. So, for instance, Imam Ahmad's contains about almost 30 set narrations, while Bukhari only contains about 7,000. And of those 7,000, 2,600 are unique, while the rest are repetitions, all of which are considered Sahih by Sunni standards. There's very strict criteria with regards to the corpus of Sunni Hadith scholarship. With regards to Shia Hadith scholarship, the Shias had their own Hadith collections. The most notable work is Al-Kafi, written by Al-Quraini. Now, this contains about 16,000 narrations. Now, however, Twelver Shia scholarship historically did not subject hadith to the same systematic grading as Sunnis until much later on. So in Shia traditions, is not kind of wholly authentic. They would admit this themselves. Now, because we have this huge disparity in authentic chains, we can compare these collections all together. So Sunni hadiths seem to be preserved a lot more extensively with authentic isnads rather than Shia works with of like kind of a similar scope. So according to Shia experts themselves, Al-Kafi only contains a minority of narrations that are actually sahih, right? So one analysis by the Shia scholar Mili, he says he founds that only about 5,000 narrations in Al-Kafi are authentic out of the 16,000. So that's like 31%. And most of them are graded as Hasan. In contrast, in Sunni collections like Musnad Ahmad, which again has almost 30,000 hadith, we have almost 75% of those as graded as authentic by Sunni standards, right? So Sahih by Sunni standards. Now, even if we take a conservative view that not all of Musnad Ahmad is Sahih, we still are left with a very large portion of it that is Sahih. So the mere fact that this ratio exists shows that Sunni hadith scholarship, when it comes to authentication, happened much earlier on than Shia scholarship. Now, the significance of this disparity is that both Sunnis and Shias have motives to include as many sound, authentic narrations as possible to trace back to the Prophet. There's motivations and incentives in both Shia parties as well as Sunni parties. Now, if forging isnads were as easy as the Orientalists are saying, why would the Shia compilers not simply fabricate more strong isnads? Why is it only 31% of the Al-Kafi that's authentic, right? So that kind of runs counterintuitive. The Shia had political and theological motivations, just like Sunnis, to establish the authenticity of kind of their imams and the Ahl Bayt through hadith. Yet the Shia collections contain relatively few Sahih hadith. This suggests that neither group could simply invent authentic isnads if they wanted to. It's not that simple. In fact, the Shia scholars often had to rely on some pool of early transmitters, many of whom were non Shia or actually Sunni, to reach the Prophet or the Imams. That kind of limits their ability to conjure up fully credible, authentic chains. The logic of this inference is that if it was so easy to fabricate authentic isnads, why didn't the Shias fabricate more authentic isnads for their narrations? The fact that they could not fabricate these authentic isnads despite having the motivation shows that it was actually very difficult to fabricate these authentic isnads. So the relative scarcity of authentic chains in Shia hadith literature is a testament to the rigor and the usefulness of the isnad system. It could not really be bypassed arbitrarily at will. And so this ultimately kind of bolsters the claim that many authentic isnads in Sunni hadith works are genuine, and they're not really a product of mass forgery. Because once again, we know that there are incentives to fabricate these hadiths, and we know that hadiths were being fabricated. But once again, the fact that so few hadith are actually authentic goes to show that people, even despite having the motivations to fabricate them, just ended up not fabricating them because it would be very easy to expose them. To conclude on this entire point, the Sunni and Shia preservation comparison directly refutes the Orientalist assertion that the abundance of authentic hadith is proof for forgery. Now we'll be going over another argument, and this argument goes over Imam Zuhri, right? So, who is Imam Zuhri? So, really, kind of, we can't even begin to talk about hadith preservation without mentioning Imam Zuhri. So Imam Zuhri is like a very pivotal figure in the first century after the Prophet, and he's often cited as one of the first to systematically kind of collect hadith. So like really his role is again can't really be understated when it comes to hadith preservation. So who is Imam Zuhri? He was a scholar of Medina, and he was born in 58 AH, which is about 50 years after the Prophet passes away. Now, from the generation, he's from the generation of the students of the companions, and it's known as the Tabi'in. And so he learns from numerous prominent companions and senior successors. Among them is Anas ibn Malik um, and Abdullah bin Umar. Both of these are like very top hadith narrators, and they've narrated multiple hadith. So he serves the Umayyad administration as a religious scholar, and he's respected by many people. Now, he's he's like a pioneer in terms of hadith compilation because we have the Umayyad Caliph Ibn Abdul Aziz, and he commissioned Az-Zuhri to actually compile written hadith collections around the year 100 AH, right? So again, very early on. Now, this makes Zuhri kind of the first person to gather these hadith in an organized written format, which predates authors like Imam Malik and Ibn Jurayj. Zuhri himself favored written hadith, which is an attitude that took time to develop. This helped ensure that by the end of the second century, substantial hadith material was being written down. This runs counter to the claim of the Orientalists that the hadith were all oral tradition for the first 200 years. But we know this is not the case. Imam Zuhri actually taught many students, and three of his most famous students are Imam Malik, Imam Abdul Razak, as well as his teachers such as Ma'mar ibn Rashid and Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, right? As well as Imam Jurayj. These names that I've mentioned are very prominent when it comes to early hadith transmission. All of these are students of Imam Zuhri, right? Imam Zuhri is very influential and very prominent in the first century of the Prophet. These students transmit Zuhri's narrations within their own books. As a result, Imam Zuhri's hadith appear in multiple early collections, providing us with a unique opportunity to cross verify what he taught. A lot of Orientalists have a lot to say about Zuhri. One of the main critiques that they have about Zuhri is that he's influenced too much by the Umayyads. As we'll see later on, that's actually not the case. He goes multiple times against the Umayyad caliphs. As a conclusion for the slide, we know that in terms of Imam Zuhri's legacy, his importance really lies in the fact that he bridges the connection between companions and later compilers. Because he wrote down so many hadith within the first century of Islam, we have this preservation of hadith material that's written down, and used word for word in later compilations of hadith. But yeah, the whole point is that Imam Zuhri seems to be a common link in multiple isnads within all of these. All right, so with regards to the reliability of transmission from Imam Zuhri, to address whether hadith chains were reliably preserved, there's multiple ways you can do this, but there is a Orientalist scholar by the name of Matsaki. He's a contemporary Western scholar. He conducted a very detailed study where he takes all of the hadith that's found from Imam Zuhri within three compilers, right? And that includes Ma'mar ibn Rashid's narrations and Imam Malik's Muwatta. By comparing these, he attempts to see whether the isnads in content remain consistent or if they show signs of later fabrications. The findings strongly support a very early rendition of Imam Zuhri's narrations. Rashid's transmission. Rashid was a direct student of Imam Zuhri, right? Now, Ma'mar kind of in his hadith corpus, we can see a pattern where he reports from Imam Zuhri about 28% of the time, right? And 25% is taken from Imam Qatada, who is a Basrian scholar. And much smaller percentages are taken from other scholars in the same vicinity. Over 75 other names appear very rarely throughout the entire corpus. The actual distribution is uneven and top heavy with two names. Again, it's Zuhri and Qatada. Now, this kind of organic pattern is unlikely if he were forging chains. It's more consistent with genuine learning that he actually learned from these two particular teachers rather than making it seem like he has a number of different teachers and that he doesn't have consistency with regards to who he's taking from. The presence of many reports with no isnads at all is actually quite revealing because a fabricator trying to bolster his authority wouldn't really include all of these unauthentic or non-authentic or unattributed reports. So the fact that Ma'mar transmits some hadith without any chains shows that he transmitted material as is without editing the manuscripts or backing it up, which implies that he didn't invent the chains that were missing. And that kind of goes to attest his credibility. Now, this is where this is where the Orientalist scholar Matsky, this is where a lot of his expertise kind of shines in, right? So what he does is he compares surviving hadiths of Imam Zuhri through multiple collections that occur in later transmitters or through his direct students. Analysis shows that the character of hadith that he took from is actually quite different. So from Az-Zuhri, only about 1/3 of Ma'mar's narrations are actually prophetic or companion traditions. 2/3 are Zuhri's own opinions, known as Rai. Among the traditions of what Zuhri transmits, the majority cite companions from Medina. That also includes Urwa, by the way, but it seems to be majority taken from companions rather than the Prophet himself. And also, about 40% of Zuhri's reports lack full isnads. In contrast, Ma'mar's narrations from Qatada are mostly Qatada's own opinions, about 62%, with fewer transmitted traditions. When Qatada does transmit, he often cites Basrian authorities like Hassan al-Basri, and kind of he actually gives complete isnads. In fact, only 12% of Qatada's transmitted traditions in Ma'mar's corpus, they only 12% of them have actual isnads versus 60% of Zuhri's tradition that includes some chains, but 40% don't have chains. So Qatada's transmission kind of emphasizes certain companions like Ali and Ibn Mas'ud, and whereas Imam Zuhri's emphasizes Umar and other kind of Medinian scholars. Now, the significance of this is that really the stark difference between how Ma'mar presents Zuhri's material and Qatada's material. Now, if Ma'mar was fabricating these hadith, one might expect a more kind of a, a more consistent really style. What I mean by that is instead of having 60% with chains and 40% without chains, we would see each source remain a distinct profile. So as Az-Zuhri's transmission reflects his vicinity of Medina and the interest of earlier authorities with regards to partial chains, while Qatada's reflects his context, which is Basra, or more opinions, which have again more opinions and fewer chains. So this suggests that Ma'mar accurately preserved the teachings of each teacher rather than mixing or inventing. Now, if Ma'mar was forging both, why would he bother making them so different? A single forger is likely to have a consistent modus operandi, and the data, however, kind of strongly implies that Ma'mar faithfully relays what he learned, and the variations come from the original teachings themselves, right? So from Zuhri versus Qatada, and not Ma'mar's own imagination. So again, the point here is that where these books are written in terms of versus Medina, we see direct results in how the isnads are. In the case of Medina, we have less opinion and more kind of transmission. We see full isnads, whereas in Basra we have more opinions and less isnads. We see more personal interpretations rather than full authentic isnads. And again, this is something that it's just so implausible if these hadith were fabricated by someone that he would get all these little details right. Now, the key, the Orientalist scholar, goes further and compares Az-Zuhri's student Malik, Ma'mar, in terms of Ibn Jurayj pattern, and Mecca also learned from Az-Zuhri, but he cites Zuhri less frequently, about 6% of his corpus, since his main teacher was Ata, who comes from Mecca. Now, still, he has a notable chunk of Zuhri's hadith, so 6% is still a lot. And his collection shows many anonymously transmitted reports, and his own opinions are Zuhri's the kind of individual who transmits his own opinions rather than presenting the full isnads. This is all very consistent. So again, it shows that systemic kind of forgery was not being taken place because there's so much overlap and consistency with the way Az-Zuhri is transmitting as a narrator. With regards to Malik's patterns, so Imam Malik, who again who's in Medina, in his Muwatta, he quotes Az-Zuhri, at least the single kind of largest source in his Muwatta comes from Imam Zuhri, right? So 20% or close to 21% of Muwatta Malik is taken from Imam Zuhri. Now, in Malik's case, all of his sources come from Medina. The generations of his sources are really early on, right? But what's interesting in all of this is that, again, Motsky analyzes these narrations, and what he finds is more than half of Ibn Jurayj's reports of Zuhri's opinions have a parallel in Ma'mar's material. Even more impressively, about 80% of Malik's quotes of Imam Zuhri's view have counterparts in Ma'mar and or Jurayj. And if we look at Malik's narrations, where Az-Zuhri is transmitting from earlier authorities, so for example, he is acting as a link in the Isnad, 85% of those have parallels in the collections of Ma'mar. Parallels here really just mean either the exact same hadith or same general content reported through a different chain. The significance of this is that such a high correspondence is extremely unlikely to occur if large scale fabrications were taking place. So there's just so much overlap that it really can't be a fabrication. So Malik, who's in Medina, Ma'mar, who's in Yemen, and Ibn Jurayj, who's in Mecca, you have to make the case that all of them conspired and had this large scale not conspiracy where they were exchanging materials and matching the narrations that Zuhri would be consistently reporting. This seems to be very implausible. Now, the cross references goes further. So, additional evidence for authenticity here is that sometimes Zuhri's opinions is transmitted even when later scholars, including his own students, actually disagree with it or find it at odds. For example, Ma'mar relays instances where he criticizes or diverges from his source's views, and that includes Zuhri. So, if Ma'mar was fabricating, or if later compilers were editing these things, why would they leave these convenience or these disagreements? Right? It makes really no sense. That they retained these views kind of shows that there's a commitment to accurately relay the information, even if you're disagreeing with that information. Now, there are cases where Zuhri and another scholar like Qatada actually hold contradictory opinions as well. These transmitters are not scared or not hiding away from these contradictions. A forger trying to push a single agenda wouldn't preserve both sides of a disagreement. The presence of divergent views suggests that we're looking at genuine scholarly discourse from the earlier period, not one that a person manufactures. Zuhri often provides partial chains or none when referring to well known companion stories, whereas in other contexts, full chains are given. This selective use of isnads, where sometimes he would present them, sometimes he wouldn't, that aligns with how a real scholar might actually operate. Sometimes he gives sources when necessary, sometimes he doesn't when he lacks them. This is something that a fabricator would not really like. We wouldn't see this dichotomy here. If it was a blanket forgery, we would expect all chains being given, right? Instead, we have almost 40% of Zuhri's narrations that lack a chain. In Qatada, 88% lack a chain. These are really high numbers. You can't boil this down to simply mass conspiracy. To conclude this case study, what we see is that with regards to kind of Zuhri's transmitted hadith, there's a clear conclusion that we can draw, which is that the Isnad system is functioning reliably within a century of the Prophet's life. Az-Zuhri's teachings, which go back to the companions or even the Prophet, were preserved through multiple independent channels with a high degree of fidelity. There's a lot of consistency within all of them. This directly refutes the notion that early collectors were simply fabricating chains and back projecting them to Zuhri earlier authorities. Since Zuhri was born just 50 years after the Prophet dies, and since he gathers all of these last surviving, or sorry, gathers these sources from the last surviving companions, this really pushes the envelope of reliability back to the first generation of the Prophet itself. These are direct kind of companions, direct eyewitnesses that Zuhri is kind of receiving this information from. And right here again, this kind of goes over what I just said, but because of this case study, we can see that the hadith material, number one, it's not necessarily being transmitted only orally, it's also being transmitted through manuscript tradition. But also, number two, it pushes the dating of these hadith much earlier to even the first century of the Prophet, right? So this is like 70 years after the Prophet passes away. We already have widespread usage of the Isnad system and widespread usage of these narrations. And again, this kind of goes over the same point here. Now, this is one of the things that I really didn't talk about much, but we can see that Arabs there's multiple studies on this, but they have a very strong tradition of oral memorization. So even again, we've already shown that orally speaking, or with regards to the narrations, there isn't necessarily this large scale oral tradition going on for like 2 centuries. We actually do have a bunch of companion documents that go over hadith, but what they show is that no single source is controlling the narrative. Different sites and regions have their own scholars, and yet we find incredible consistency with regards to how they're preserving the narrations and the tradition of the narrator. This is the conclusion of this entire presentation. But now, modern Western scholars like Matsky kind of showed that the works of the earlier Orientalists, which include like Schacht and Dessner, they're kind of misleading, right? So, Matsky, Scholler, and a bunch of like newer Orientalists are kind of paving a new path. They're showing that these hadith are not all kind of forgeries. There is remarkable similarity and consistency between these early transmitters. They shatter the Orientalist argument that these transmitters or common links were fabricators and that they were kind of publicizing or fabricating narrations that suit their own agenda. The Sunni stance, the Orthodox Sunni position, is not that these hadith were not being fabricated. It's actually the opposite. It's the Sunni scholars themselves who are catching these fabricators. So yeah, once again, the the arguments here in this presentation, they're meant to go over the reliability of the Isnad system. And the next presentation, which will probably be the last, we'll be going over the material surviving evidence and comparing that to the tradition, showing that the tradition is actually right even after we have these written sources and these manuscripts that we find much later on. The tradition still upholds quite authentically.